Happy Monday. I hope you're doing well. We are going to finish up chapter 17 today, looking at nations and empires, 1850 to 1914. And today we'll be looking specifically at expansion in Russia and China, and actually Japan. I don't know why I didn't include that in the subtitle, but that's going to be in there as well. All right, so imperialism and culture. Both the Europeans and the Americans were hoping to bring, quote, civilization to the people in their colonies. And really, since the Crusades, the Europeans especially had had this mindset that they were superior to other people. And you can see this in the way that they write about people from other places. And almost in every instance, they're writing about these people as if they are inferior. Overseas expansion reinforced ideas of superiority. And the reason why is because when they went overseas and began to colonize overseas, typically people looked very different than them. And so they felt like that they, the Europeans and the Americans, were culturally and racially superior, and the people in their colonies were inferior. And of course, undergirding all of that is this idea of social Darwinism. We know that Darwin talked about the survival of the fittest. And so social Darwinism says that some people, like the Europeans, have attained wealth because they are the fittest. They're the ones who have survived and reproduced. And so they felt justified in their wealth. They felt justified in their right to rule. And they even believed that it was their duty to rule. I don't know if you're familiar with Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, but there was this mindset that it was their civilizing duty, the Europeans, to their colonies, to bring them into civilization and to acclimate them to modern society. All right, imperialism was celebrated. Portable cameras appeared during this time. And so it allowed these images of colonies and the mother country to be sent in postcards all around the world. It was in advertising, even in the packaging on certain goods being shipped out, like tins that held tea and tobacco and chocolate even celebrated imperialism. All right, so we're going to look at the pressures of expansion in Russia, Japan, and China, starting with Japan. So Japan really began to expand with the Meiji Restoration, and this took place from 1868 to 1912, and this is the process by which Japan became a modern state, a modern nation. And so in 1868, elites in Japan overthrew the shogunate, and so the shogunate, even though there was still an emperor, the shogun was like the military dictator in Japan. Tokugawa is the family that was ruling because the shogun the shogunate was a hereditary position. And so in the shogun's place, they put the emperor back in his, quote, rightful place and got rid of the shogunate altogether. In addition to that, they also embarked upon economic development, mainly or starting with land reform, which allowed peasants to become small landholders. And in doing so, this actually improved their productivity. So like rather than them working on the land of someone else and just being rewarded a portion of the crop, they were actually given small plots of land to do with what they pleased. And so they worked harder since it was their piece of land. Also, to promote economic development, they created a uniform currency throughout Japan. This made trade and the buying and selling of goods so much easier. They also started a postal system, and this was good. This would allow communication throughout the empire, or not throughout the empire, but throughout the nation much more quickly. It would later become an empire. And just like not that long after, like 60 years after this. All right, so telegraph lines. Postal system allowed for mail to go from place to place more efficiently, but the cool thing about telegraph lines with this was that it allowed for instant communication. So if you had a telegraph station nearby, you could send a message to someone on the other side of Japan instantly, or you could even send it to someone in China or someone in Korea. They also set up foreign trade associations to make trade with other nations more efficient and easier. In addition to that, they set up savings and export campaigns as well to encourage exports. They built railroads. This was great. Japan is an elongated nation. It is long, it is an island, and so having railroads that connect cities from city to city, it makes travel, it makes trade, shipping goods, all of that so much easier. Once Japan began to embark upon imperialism themselves, they viewed that as a win because it created more markets for Japanese goods. So starting with Korea in 1910, and then in the 1930s, they go for Shanghai and Manchuria as well and begin to build an empire in the Pacific. But the reason why they do that, it's the same reason why the Europeans did it, was, well, one, to gain from them raw materials, but two, to open up more markets. So more people will be buying Japanese goods. They, like the Europeans, viewed their colonies, or the people living in their colonies, as inferior. So, of course, the Japanese expected their colonies to serve their economic interests. And so, in particular, they developed rice production for export to Japan. And then Taiwan also exported sugar to the rest of Asia, not just to Japan, but the rest of Asia, gaining more money for Japan. All right, Russia embarked upon a similar path of transformation and expansion, and theirs happened also in the late 19th century. And this one was a defensive reaction because they lost a war. They lost the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. Granted, it was an alliance of France, the United Kingdom, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia that they were fighting against, so that's kind of a tough loss there. But they realized that they would continue to be defeated if they did not modernize. And so they began making internal reforms. One thing about Russia is that they did not switch to like a democratic or a representative form of government. They held on to the Tsar. They held on to autocratic rule. And so there was still a monarch. There was still one ruler. They abolished serfdom, which this is crazy considering Western Europe had abolished serfdom, a few hundred years before this. Even though they abolished serfdom, the landholders did keep the best land for themselves, and the former serfs, in order to have the land, the poor land they received, they had to pay a large redemption tax to keep it. So it was difficult, even though it wasn't serfdom, it still kept these serfs or these peasants in a cycle of poverty. Okay, so the government also reformed the education system and their legal systems. They, like the Japanese, encouraged railroads or companies to build railroads. They encouraged industrial production, and they also encouraged mining. And so they began expanding in the 1860s when they conquered Turkestan, which is southwest of Russia. From there, they migrated into Central Asia. Then they conquered much of the Caucasus Mountains. And the reason why they took that was to prevent it from being taken over by the Ottomans or the Persians. This was actually the westernmost part of Russia. And so it was sort of like a buffer zone between Russia and the Ottomans. Not only that, they took Manchuria from China in the late 1860s. And then in order to invest in the land that they had acquired, they sold Alaska to the United States. Around the same time, they actually built a Trans-Siberian Railroad as well. So that's kind of another thing that the Japanese did. They appointed governors to rule conquered land. In some of these instances, they promoted Russification. This is just, they were Russianizing people. They wanted the people that they conquered to use the Russian language. They wanted the people that they conquered to promote Russian culture and things like that. In some places, though, they respected cultural autonomy and even allowed some of the locals to rule on their behalf. So that kind of goes against the Russian autocratic mindset, but in some instances, they actually did allow their conquered people to continue ruling as long as they were loyal to the Russians. All right, so China. China was slower than the Russians. They were also slower than the Japanese to emulate European models of imperialism and industrialism. They did eventually adopt Western learning and Western skills. This happened first through the 1860s self-strengthening movement, and there were some reformist bureaucrats in China who realized that if they did not adopt a Western style of technology and learning and science and medicine and things like that, that they would be overtaken. And so they began to build arsenals, they began to build shipyards, they began to build coal mines, steamships, and they believed in this so much that they actually sent some of their students, they sent 120 students abroad so that they could learn this Western style education and technology and things like that. So the conservatives in China, these would be people who wanted to stick with the traditional way of governing, were obviously very skeptical about these efforts at self-strengthening. They thought that if China continued to industrialize, it would lead to unemployment. And then some of them even believed that the railroads were ugly. They thought that it disrupted the harmony of nature. And they even thought it brought disharmony to humans. In fact, they built a short railroad and then tore it up shortly after it was built in 1877. So looking at internal reform efforts, population pressures, which always kind of seems to be an issue in China, led people to migrate from the interior to the frontier parts. So like they were migrating to Manchuria and to Southeast Asia and to Central Asia. China was actually defeated in the Sino-Japanese War. They lost to Japan in a war, and this led to further attempts at reform by the Qing dynasty. And this set of reforms was called the 100 Days Reform. And so it's kind of funny, China was defeated by Japan in this war, but scholars wanted China to emulate Japan, to develop railroads, to develop modern banking. And actually in 1898, the emperor agreed to this. Unfortunately for him, there was lots of people who opposed this effort at modernization, and said they rallied around the empress, and she put the emperor under house arrest and ended the reforms. And so China at this point continued to fall behind the rest of the world in terms of technology and modernization. All right, so just looking at some concluding thoughts about this chapter. One of the themes of this chapter was nationalism, which spread tremendously during this time. Between 1850 and 1914, most of the world's population actually lived in empires, not nation states. And so this stirring nationalism would lead to World War I and many other conflicts in the 1900s. Nation building often led to colonization. Because states had acquired enough wealth to expand and extend beyond their national borders, they did. And so colonization was integral to nation building in many societies. Brazil did this, Japan did this, the United States did this, many places did this. Imperialism led to increased global connection. So because of nation building and setting up colonies, the world became smaller in a sense. Industrialism spread. Labor, capital, commodities, all of that moved across the world, at much higher rates than it ever had before. And lastly, ironically, imperialism sometimes encouraged nationalist movements among the, quote, conquered. Interestingly, to oppose the United States invaders, the Philippines used Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And so there were colonial subjects who often used rhetoric of nationalism in order to assert their autonomy from empire. So it's kind of ironic how that worked. All right, so y'all have a great day. Don't forget to send me a picture of your notes. I love you all.